Now that gets us to an interesting question, which is something else I agreed I'd talk about, which is illegal drugs and kind of a market for, and what happens when you try to prohibit something like rhino horns or drugs or something like that. So let's try to model prohibitions in general, but maybe a prohibition on illegal drugs, in that way. So the way I think about this problem, and the way I kind of started thinking about this problem, and Gary and I wrote a paper along these lines, is to think about there being a demand for drugs, and initially think that these drugs are legal, and you know they're constant marginal cost industry, right? They might be upward sloping, who cares? But they're a constant marginal cost industry, and the competitive price would be equal to marginal cost in equilibrium. And you know, the fact that it's perfectly competitive doesn't really matter. If it was some imperfectly competitive with some equilibrium markup over marginal cost, it really wouldn't change the analysis much at all, right? Perfectly competitive, just a nice simple model to utilize. And then you say, well, we want to make this drug illegal, okay? And in particular, we're going to make it illegal by having a policy of punishing suppliers, right? That's the key. It's going to be and I think that's a reasonable description of the approach many countries have taken to make drugs illegal. It's been a focus on the suppliers. Maybe they're the smugglers who bring drugs in from abroad. Maybe they're the street-level dealers who deal the drugs. But it's a focus on the supply side of the problem. We're going to assume, at least initially, that there's no effect of this prohibition on the demand for drugs. That is, the willingness to pay of people to get drugs is going to be the same when they're illegal as when they're legal. We might come back and say, well, no, there's something about making them illegal, and people have argued both ways. Making it illegal reduces demand because people don't like doing illegal things. Other people said making illegal increases demand, particularly for young people or somebody who feel like, well, this is my way to like rebel and be whatever. So I'm going to put both of those arguments aside and say it just doesn't have an effect. The key point is it raises the cost of supplying drugs by forcing these suppliers to do things that they otherwise wouldn't, right? That is, they might have to be sneaky in terms of how they get their drugs into the country. They got to produce them in some illegal way as opposed to a factory that might be very efficient. We might have to, these people might be, have to hire guards to protect they can't use contracts, for example, to deal with their suppliers and their customers, so they have to kill them if they don't do what they want, right? They have to, they have to do all kinds of stuff like that, and that's costly. And by making it costly, you're able to raise the price up to P hat. That is, you were able to raise the street price of drugs above what they would be if they were legal by making suppliers incur these extra costs. And I'm going to assume this is also a constant cost industry, although you might think that there are reasons why this wouldn't be constant cost while this would be, right? That is, you've changed the industry fundamentally when you make it illegal, because what causes an upward sloping supply curve is some notion of comparative advantage. And while there might not be much comparative advantage at, changing Sudafed into methamphetamine, that anybody with a chemistry set could do that, there might be a lot of competitive advantage in terms of like avoiding the police or being violent enough to enforce your contracts. And there's a different set of assets that are valuable in the illegal market than are valuable in the legal market. It could go the other way too. I'm just saying, once you've made it illegal, there's no reason to believe the producers are going to be the same. And we definitely saw that like when we had alcohol prohibition in the United States. It's not like the same guys who used to produce legal alcohol just took their factory and turned it over to make it an illegal alcohol factory, right? It was That's not how the world worked. It changed completely how the good was produced, marketed, who was selling it. And then when we got rid of Prohibition, guess what? It changed completely again. The guy, Al Capone didn't become like, the guy making, running Budweiser, right? He lost his comparative advantage when it became legal. And so anyway, I'm going to put that aside. I'm just going to assume it shifts costs up. Well, is that a good idea? Is that why in the hell would we want to do this? Why would we want to raise costs? Reduce quantity demanded. Right, yes, that's important. So we're going to switch the quantity from QC to Q hat, okay, corresponding to P hat. All right? Well, is that a good idea? Okay, let's assume we thought there was an externality from consuming drugs. Okay? Now, what would have to be true? Let's assume that the elasticity of demand less than 1 in absolute value, right? That is, demand is inelastic, okay? Let me just use a number just to make things simple. Let's say elasticity of demand is a half, okay? Minus a half, okay? Minus a half, okay? And let's just say P hat equals 4 times P star, okay? All right, just assume we've quadrupled prices. These numbers are not crazy, okay? I've kind of picked numbers that are in the realm of possibility, okay? So what would that mean about Q hat? Q hat would be what? Well, it would be 1/2 QC. Everybody agrees with that? That is, got elasticity of demand of a half. You've quadruple the price, so that means you're going to cut the quantity by the square root of that, so that's going to be 2. You're going to cut the quantity in half, right? But everybody knows that, right? What is it? What's the form of a constant elasticity demand of a half? It's Q equals AP to the minus a half, right? That's the elasticity of demand of a half. And therefore, if I quadruple P, I'm going to cut Q in half. Right? That's because the square root of 4 is 2. All right? So what does that tell me? Well, it tells me that this area here, even though it doesn't look like it in terms of my graph, is equal to what? Double that area there. Right? Let me redraw my picture just to make it redraw my picture a little more to scale. So I want this box. I kind of want that box, right? That's my picture. It's going to look more like that. So this area here, that's kind of the picture. It looks like that, right? So there's 3 of these boxes up here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boxes. This has 4 boxes, and this has 2, right? That's the way to look at the world, okay? So now think about what that tells us. The real resources being used up have done what? What's happened to the real resources being used to produce these drugs? They've doubled. We're spending twice as much real resources now to produce the drugs than we were before. And we're getting half as many drugs. But he agrees with that. So what if these drugs were socially worthless? That is, the social cost of the extra consumption was equal to the private benefit, so that the net value of these additional drugs was 0. Would this policy make sense? No, this policy would make no sense. Right? We would be spending twice as much and accomplishing nothing, right? We would not be getting a net benefit. we'd be getting the same total value because we'd lose the private benefits of consuming drugs, but we'd gain we'd reduce the social cost by an equal amount, and therefore we'd be worse off rather than better off. Yes?
In the long run, could this go down because people are like less addicted or something?
Okay, so we might want to use a long-run demand curve here. We might want to use a more elastic long-run demand curve. In fact, I chose the half trying to think of what might the long-run elasticity might be. But you're right. Okay, so really what's going on is, unlike a tax, where you might argue that a big fraction or that tax, or in some simple cases, that entire revenue is just a transfer to somebody else. This kind of a way of getting lower consumption, of raising the real cost of production, is incredibly inefficient, right? It's incredibly inefficient because we lose the rectangle, right? You would have to believe, how big would you have to think the externality of that consumption was? Well, you have to believe that the net value of that extra consumption was like twice the total expenditure to even get there, right? You'd have to have another. You'd have to make it substantially worse, right? You'd have to have the loss from not producing those other units. We didn't produce these units, so we saved those resources. That's a good thing. But we incurred all these extra costs, so the reduction in externality would have to be equal to the difference between these two. Okay? Now, what's in this rectangle? What costs would be in that rectangle? Where do these costs come from in the illegal drug market? Yeah. Right. So, for example, one of the things that in here is, if I'm a drug dealer, I might get shot. I might get killed. The other thing that is in there is that I might kill somebody and then I have to go to prison. Okay? Well, a couple important things. One is, while it includes the cost of putting me in, includes the cost on me of going to prison, it doesn't include the cost of putting me in prison, right? The drug dealers don't internalize that. So there's an externality associated with the area in this rectangle. The other thing is, drug dealers aren't that great a shot. They don't just kill other drug dealers. They kill other people in the process, right? They're trying to shoot a drug dealer maybe, but they might miss and hit somebody else, all right? The other thing they might do to try to get around and produce these drugs is they might corrupt the local officials. They might corrupt the police. They might corrupt the public officials in various countries around the world. You'd have to add that to this rectangle as well. It's an empirical matter. They seem to spend a lot of energy killing each other. Right? That's the first and foremost reason I talk about it, is that they do a lot of killing of each other. And, you know, and why do they do that? Why doesn't Procter & Gamble go out and, like, kill the other guys in the dish soap market, you know? It is, but why do they compete that way? Well, why? Well, part of it is economies of scope again. That is, we've created, one of the things that they need to do to enforce their contracts with people is be violent. They can't use the court. So who selects into being a drug dealer or running a drug cartel? People who don't mind using violence. The other thing is, one of the ways we've fought drug dealers and raised their cost is by attacking them militarily, right? But what happens when you attack people militarily? Well, they want to defend themselves militarily. Again, once I have all that military capability, why should I limit to using it against the government? I'm going to use it against my competitors, right? We've economies of scope again. Again, this right? This is the scale effect at work again. I got a scale effect of military activity and violence. I mean, and if you look at, for example, what's happened in Mexico, one of the adverse consequences of Mexico's crackdown on the drug cartels is they ended up basically getting rid of the less violent cartels and increasing the comparative advantage of the more violent cartels, who have expanded their reach and their market shares in Mexico. Yeah. That's the point. You can't punish them either, right? They already have to do a bunch of illegal stuff, and you're already going to throw them in jail for drug dealing, right? This is what is called the marginal deterrence problem, right? This is right. I got this guy. He's already killed a bunch of people. He's going to face the death penalty already, and I want to take him captive. Well, you got like a problem, right? He's got a serious incentive to fight with all his might because there's the marginal deterrence you can impose isn't so great. And that's kind of the problem you have with the drug dealers, right? They've structured their business in such a way that, you're not going to say, well, see, you guys are criminals. Nobody's going to deal with you anymore. Well, you already were known to be criminals, right? Why wouldn't Blackwater go out and kill their competitors? Well, they'd lose a lot of contracts. If it became known that they'd killed their competitors, they'd lose a lot of business, right? When the drug cartel in Mexico go kill the competitors, they don't lose business. They gain business. People say, yeah, I like those guys. They'll protect my drugs. They'll protect, right? That's a good thing from their point of view. Because, again, it's about marginal versus average, right? There's very little marginal disincentive. There's not rising marginal cost in this world. Once I've already been labeled as a criminal, marginal cost of being labeled a bigger criminal isn't so low, right? I mean, I think, right, that the difference between a rising marginal cost scenario and a declining marginal cost scenario is very important. And I think that's what we're saying, right? That is, the marginal cost to me of being labeled a criminal is lower when I'm already known to be a criminal. Most economic problems, we assume the opposite. We assume marginal cost is rising with output. So if I'm already starting to be labeled a criminal, I really don't want to be labeled a super criminal. But I think when it comes to criminal activity, it probably doesn't work that way. Being a super criminal is better than being a not so super criminal, right? It's back to, right? But isn't that back to our Roy model where we said the key thing is you don't want to be like in the indifference point. If you're going to be over here, you might as well be far, because once you've decided I'm going to be in the criminal sector, I want to be the best criminal I can be. Yeah, I think you can try to alter the incentives. You can try to alter the incentives, which is to say we're going to only go after the most violent people. We will leave together. Now, that's often hard to enforce. Because what actually often happens with enforcement, let's say there's two drug dealers, and this happens even when they're the same. Two drug dealers, right? You and the person next to you, both drug dealers. And I'm the person in charge by the government with catching drug dealers, right? Well, think about it. I could impose costs on both of you guys and push both of your guys' costs up to here. But that's unlikely to be a good scenario for me. The better thing for me to do is to say, look, I'm not going to impose any costs on you. That's going to generate a bunch of rents for you. But in order to preserve your rents, I got to impose costs on her. I got to make her costs high and your costs low, and then you'll share some of those rents with me. You can see how corruption just like jumps off the screen at us here, right? Because that's an easy way. If I didn't police either of you guys, then there would be no rents because prices would fall and there would be no rents to share with me. The way I maximize the rents is I catch her, allow you to sell drugs, and you give me some of the money. Sounds familiar, right? And at the same time, I look like I'm doing my job. You help me catch her, right? Look, I'm doing my job. I'm hauling in all these drugs, and I go on TV, and I show these big piles of drugs I've confiscated. And isn't this a great world? You know, it seems to me that's the equilibrium. Why should I impose costs on both of you guys? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Not in my interest. So that's what I'm trying to say. Not only are we imposing costs on people, we're generating all these other externalities on top of that. And what's the problem? Now, what if we had such an effective enforcement that we basically eliminated the industry? That is, we basically could really squeeze this industry out of existence. Well, then, even though I'm severely penalizing people who do this, the total cost could be quite low. And so prohibitions aren't always bad. They're bad when they're not particularly effective. When they're not particularly effective in that the total size of the market grows, then that means you're imposing a lot of costs on the suppliers, which usually means you're imposing a lot of costs on society and yourself on top of that. And therefore, it's unlikely, unless this is an extremely socially undesirable activity, that you'd want to do it. So it's interesting. You may, in fact, want to exterminate an industry that you would not want to have a modest reduction in. And let me kind of show you the example. Think about the following problem, okay? Think about it this way, and this is so here's demand, okay? I'll make linear demand. That makes life easy. Linear demand curve, right? Here's demand, right? Now, if you think about it, and let's ignore externalities of production, like we'll ignore the fact that it costs money to imprison people and they're going to corrupt the government and all that stuff. We'll put that aside and we'll face all you're going to do is raise their total cost. But it's a competitive industry, so total cost in the industry is going to be equal to total revenue. That's all I want to impose. That the total, this industry, whatever it is, if I want to get the price up to some level, I got to get costs up to that level. So C times Q, well, that's cost per unit, times Q, has to equal P times Q. That's all I need. Well, what that means is that marginal total cost equals total revenue, so marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So actually, the marginal cost curve for this industry actually looks like that. Okay? All right? Until you get to the competitive outcome, right? Until you get to the competitive outcome. And then, of course, marginal cost from there is here. Okay? But ignore that. From the competitive outcome back, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now, think about what that means. Think about what that means, that if marginal revenue equals your marginal cost. Okay? And let's assume there was an externality, and let's let K equal the per unit externality. Well, then the net social value would look like that, D minus K, right? You would just subtract from the private marginal value schedule, which is the demand curve, you would just subtract the social cost. So this is the example you were talking about, an externality. Well, you might say, well, geez, that means we should go here, right? You think of that as the optimal point. Q star. Then, of course, that would imply this is P star. Is that true, though? Would that would equate the social marginal cost of production with the social marginal value of production. But what do you notice about that picture? Think about it. For all outputs between 0 and Q star, marginal cost of those units of output exceeds social value. For all the units beyond that point, marginal cost is below marginal value. So that's not a maximum. That's actually a minimum. That is the worst possible place to be. Right? It's the social minimum. It minimizes the net gain to society. So in this simple example, if I could freely choose to set the price anywhere I want it, I can just say I'm going to impose enough costs on suppliers to get the price up to whatever level I want. I'm just going to beat them up with sticks until the price gets up to where I want it. Right? I'm just going to impose costs on them. It says I would either want to do nothing and stay at the competitive output, or I'd want to eradicate the industry. That's it. And that's the extreme version of this point I was making. An ineffective prohibition is very bad because you're imposing all these costs on people without getting a whole lot of benefit. So you'd either want to eradicate the industry, go all the way to here, or if that's not worth it, you'd want to just stay at the competitive level, which I guess would be over here. Right? That's the answer. And then what would determine which one you want to do? Well, which one you want to do would be determined by how big the externality was. If the externality was huge, you'd want to exterminate the industry. Otherwise, tough crap. You can't do anything about it. Yeah?
So can you just explain real quickly why the point where the D minus K line crosses marginal cost isn't in some way an option?
You could go to this point here. You could say at that point, marginal social value, which is measured by this line, K down from the demand curve, right? Because the height of the demand curve is the marginal private value. To get the marginal social value, we got to subtract K. So that's the marginal value to society of an additional unit of output. And at the competitive level, we got too much output, right? That, it doesn't necessarily cost it zero, whatever. That is, at the competitive level, we got too much output. Now, the usual Pigouvian story is, therefore, we want to tax this good and get the quantity down. But this isn't like Pigou, because that rectangle is not a transfer here. That rectangle is a cost. And therefore, it's very costly to reduce output. In fact, you almost never want to reduce output a little bit. It's not going to be enough for you. In this example, you're either going to, now here, marginal social value, right, equals marginal social cost. That would be the point you would want to be at, would be right there, that quantity level, which would correspond to Q star, which of course would correspond to a market price up here. That would be the minimum point, though. That would be the worst possible point. Because you reduced all these units of consumption where it was very inefficient to reduce output, and then you didn't do all the reductions that would be efficient, which is going from here to zero. Well, like we have a prohibition on murder, right? And we think, right, that you can think of it as a prohibition on murder. And I think we we haven't eradicated murder, but, the point is we haven't made the industry bigger, right? That's the problem here, right? That is, we actually made this a bigger industry measured by cost, total cost. When demand's inelastic, you're making the industry bigger as you fight the war. That's the problem with the war on drugs in some sense, right? Is I go out to fight the war on drugs, in order to reduce quantity, I push up price, but I'm actually raising revenue for the industry, which is in some sense funding the guys on the other side, right? I'm sort of funding the opposition by giving them more revenue, right? Now I'm accomplishing my goal of reducing consumption, but I'm dragging resources into the industry, not pushing resources out. And the problem when the resources come in is twofold. One, that's just more resources, which is this rectangle. But also, the resources that aren't even getting counted here are probably proportional in some sense to the resources that are getting counted. So if I'm not only dragging resources in, but the resources I'm dragging in are guys with bazookas and guys who are corrupting the government, all those resources carry costs with them too. So that's what makes it so counterproductive. I'm making the industry bigger, and instead of spending that money on transportation costs and chemists and people to build the goods, they're spending it on all these other things that have costs associated. So these costs are worse than those costs. So there's not only more total cost, the types of costs that you have more social problems. And it's funny, when you go to talk to people about the war on drugs, they say, well, why do we need to fight the war on drugs? Oh, God, drugs are so horrible. If we didn't have the war on drugs, we'd have rampant crime and all these gangs would take over the world. What do you mean? Gangs would be out of the business if we didn't have the war on drugs, right? The things you are calling the cost of drug consumption are typically, you just ask somebody at a cocktail party, all right, tell me all the bad things about drugs. Just let them list. Almost everything they'll list is the cost of the war on drugs, not the cost of the drugs themselves. They'll come up with a few things about the cost of drugs, but 90% of what they'll point to is the cost of the war on drugs, the consequences of it being illegal, not the consequences of the drugs themselves. Yeah. I think it has a couple of, I think there does. I think there are a couple reasons. One of the things that probably is counterproductive, again, I'll focus on counterproductive since I like that side. One of the things that makes it counterproductive is it often makes it more difficult for people who want to quit drugs to get the help they need because they risk prosecution and other things. But also, they often disconnect themselves from their families because they have to go associate with a bunch of people who are doing illegal stuff, and their families aren't. That isn't conducive to staying connected to probably the people who are most likely to be able to help you. And that's not good. I mean, I'm a big believer that families are an important part of helping people deal with problems. And if you tell me when I have a drug problem, I'm going to be more isolated from my family than I would be if it was a legal drug problem, I think that's going to mitigate people's ability. And that can raise demand effectively by making it harder to quit. Prohibition of lobbying. Yeah, I think what you have to ask, if there would still be a lot of lobbying, even when you prohibited it. Now, why is it that it's so hard to get a prohibition to work? Why is it that it's very hard to get the quantity to fall? And the answer is, to me, is that the demanders are not cooperating in this experiment, right? It's like if there was somebody trying to kill you and you said, help me, I'd say, fine, stand over here and I'll protect you. And I got some chance of protecting you from people who want to kill you when you don't want to be killed. But when you want to consume drugs and my job is to protect you from yourself, that is a really hard task because you're going to do everything you can to undermine my efforts to, quote, protect you, right? That's what makes prohibition so hard is, right, the demanders don't have an incentive to kind of cooperate in this game. They have an incentive to fight they're fighting me too. It's not just the suppliers who want to sell the drugs, the demanders want to avoid it. So I'd say, God, I can protect you. I can get rid of drug dealers in 98% of the locations. That doesn't do any good. The demanders will just go to the 2% where I can't. And that's what we see. And they often end up going to the places we probably wouldn't want them to go for lots of other reasons. That's the denatured alcohol approach, right? That's what we do with alcohol. We already do that with alcohol. We actually do put something in alcohol to make it so it's very bad for you to drink it. Okay? What? Now, that would be horrible if we did it for all alcohol, right? So I think this works much more effective. Again, you got to make demand elastic enough, right? Because that's a real tax. That's very much like this, right? This height is then the death probability or whatever, right? This is the chance of death. But it better be elastic enough demand that people don't take the poison drugs. Now, how do you make it demand more elastic? One is to choose which drugs you do it to. That is not try to get rid of all drugs, but say, well, geez, I can get rid of this drug by poisoning it as long as people have good enough substitutes, namely other drugs. But if I tried to poison all drugs, I'd be really worried that even if there's a small fraction of people left, the total cost might rise. No, but then the effectiveness is proportionately reduced too, right?
Consumers are already doing that, and people still use the drugs.
There's a precedent from the CIA. They accidentally sold a bunch of Stinger missiles, and they were kind of getting on in terrorist hands. They just put another 10% on the market, except for they booby-trapped them and killed the market. So I was thinking,
No, you need to kill the market, though. That's the key. It's back to elasticity. You need the response to be elastic enough, right? Because this rectangle in that context is nothing more than the people who end up consuming it anyway and getting killed, right? Because that's where, in your simple example, where the only thing I did was make these booby-trapped Stinger missiles or these poison drugs, this rectangle is exactly the people who get killed, right? The size of that rectangle is the guys who get killed from the poison drugs and the booby-trapped missiles. That's only a good idea if demand is elastic enough. Now, in the case of terrorists, you might think killing them has its own value. So if they, you'd be even happier if they still bought them and got blown up, right? That would be like double benefit. You'd not only get fewer missiles sold, you'd kill some terrorists in the process. We don't generally apply that to drug consumers. We don't generally say, well, geez, we'd kill a bunch of them, and wouldn't that be good, right? Even though, yes. There are claims, I don't know how much evidence there is. This forbidden fruit effect is the one that people often talk about in the positive direction. I think there are. I think it's pretty clear that you can have some effect in the other direction as well. That, people obey rules partly because they don't like violating rules. Now, there's another cost, though. I think there's another effect, which is once people start violating some rules, then they might start violating other rules. And therefore, you got to factor that in. That is, once I've decided I'm going to consume illegal drugs and I start visiting people who engage in illegal activities, well, while I'm there, might as well do more illegal stuff, right? I mean, that's not an all unreasonable idea. You start associating with a different crowd, you start doing things different than you would otherwise. You got to factor that in too. So I wouldn't just limit it to this good. I think this is a bit like we talked about last time, which is I give you the ability to lie to people. You got to think about the broader implications. And I think that's the same thing that happens with prohibitions. I think it's very dangerous to have a system in which a big segment of society is engaged in illegal activity, because that, I think, facilitates other illegal activities through these kind of scale effects again. There's a kind of a fixed cost element to dealing in these kind of areas.